Good afternoon, everyone. I mean, it's just on midday, so we've got a lot to get through. There's still some people joining, but we might make a start. Welcome to the final seminar in the American Chamber of Commerce, Hong Kong's supply chain series. Today, we'll be focusing on sustainability in global trade. So thank you for joining us. I'm Jeremy Birch, a member of the Trade and Investment Committee and the Shadow Economy Task Force at the Chamber. Outside of my role at AmCham, I'm a partner specialising in corporate crime and investigations at law firm Herbert Smith Freehills. Today's topic is incredibly important and comes at a critical time, so it's great to see such a large level of engagement from our members on the topic. Environmental, social and governance issues, which are the core elements of sustainability, are a growing focus in the commercial world. The conduct of corporates in global trade is increasingly being scrutinised through an ESG lens by governments, regulators, NGOs, and the public. With sustainability more and more often being viewed as a proxy for long-term value, the benefit of sound ESG credentials for corporations is clear, but equally clear are the risks of falling behind and failing to adapt. Obviously an important topic to the AmCham community, which is why we're grateful to be joined today by an esteemed panel. So I'd like to introduce the panel today. First, we have Adina Lowe. Adina is chair at the Ethical Toy Program, the Ethical Supply Chain Program for the global toy and entertainment industry. The program brings manufacturers, brands, retailers, and civil society partners together to monitor, manage, and fix social sustainability issues. Adina was also previously Global Vice President of Supply Chain Compliance and Sustainability at Mattel. Next, we have Kyle Bogler. He's the Director for Worker Rights and Safety for VF Corporation. VF Corporation is a global leader in branded lifestyle apparel, footwear and accessories, and since joining VF, Kyle has visited factories, sourcing offices and distribution centres in over 50 countries. He currently lives in Hong Kong and leads a team focusing on worker rights and safety across VF's global manufacturing base of over 1,000 factories with more than 1 million workers. Next, we have Matthew Chan. Matthew leads the Asia Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association Strategic and International Policy Advocacy on behalf of 135 member firms. He also leads ASIFMA's Thinking and Policy Advocacy on Sustainable Finance. Matt's experience spans financial services, government, technology, market infrastructure, strategy, corporate governance, sustainability, and environmental engineering. Lastly, we have Sharon Yap, who works as a principal in the sustainability strategy team at South 32, a global mining and metals company, where she specialises in human rights. Recent experience of Sharon also includes working as the manager for strategic policy and business at the Walk Free Foundation, and she was part of the team that successfully advocated for the Australian Modern Slavery Act and launched the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, including the AAA framework for private-public sector collaboration in the Indo-Pacific region. Moderating the panel today, we're joined by Tara Dermott, who is the head of the UN Migration Agency, IOM, in Hong Kong, where she leads a dynamic team committed to supporting diverse migrant populations and the communities wherein they live. Current priorities of Tara's team include promoting ethical recruitment of migrant workers, strengthening access to justice for trafficked persons, facilitating safe movement of vulnerable migrants, and continuing engagement with public and private sectors to realise the many positive benefits of labour migration. So thank you to the panel for joining us this afternoon. So first off, to give us a high-level overview, Tara, could you just give us the framework for thinking about these issues before the panel dives into the practical details, and perhaps touch on what the current sustainability priorities are?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me to join today. It's really such an important subject, and I'm delighted to see so many people tuning in. So there are currently a lot of sustainability priorities across both people and planet, and this is no surprise. 2020 has brought with it huge reality checks. We have had record-breaking numbers of storms and wildfires, and these have made clear the increasing impact of climate change. The global pandemic has further exacerbated weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our institutions, shining a spotlight on human rights violations in supply chains. There are 152 million children currently in child labor, and child rights are expected to worsen within the context of the pandemic, exacerbating hunger and further limiting access to education. Millions of migrant workers, already overrepresented in situations of modern slavery, have lost employment, been stranded, made homeless, and are experiencing wage theft. Now more than ever, it is so important to strengthen global efforts through sustainable and responsible business. Now, a simple definition of responsible business is business that is ethical, efficient, meets or exceeds regulation, and that it cares about people in the environment. And when discussing responsible business, there are a lot of terms that we use. So there's the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. There's ESG, which has already been referred to, the environmental, social, and corporate governance. Now, ultimately, these simply provide frameworks by which diverse stakeholders can track positive contributions and change. Now, unfortunately, as of 2020, the latest SDG data shows us that even before COVID-19, progress remained uneven, and we were not on track to meet our goals by 2030. Oh, sorry, Jeremy, I can't hear you.
Thanks, Tara. What about global commitments? What commitments have been made and why?
Yeah, so there are a lot of commitments that have been made, but I'm really going to focus on the global goals because they're pretty foundational. So the SDGs, or the global goals, which I've already referred to, are really the latest incarnation of global efforts to coordinate a response to improve human lives and to protect the environment, dating back to 1992 when 178 countries adopted Agenda 21. Then in 2000, we launched the Millennium Development Goals to reduce extreme poverty by 2015. At the same time, the UN Global Compact launched. And now this is a non-binding pact to encourage business worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies. Now, the UN Global Compact has since grown into the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, which is wonderful. But fast forward 15 years. So in 2015, we adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this has the 17 SDGs at its core and 169 indicators by which to track global progress. I hope all of you are familiar with these, but just in case not, I want to name a couple of examples of goals. So one is Goal 8, which is about promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And a key indicator under this, indicator 8.7, is to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor. Another goal is 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. A key indicator under this is to encourage companies to adopt sustainable practices and to report. And of course, we're tracking this by looking at how many businesses are publishing sustainability reports. So it's now 2020. We have 10 years remaining. This year was supposed to be the start of the decade of action, and clearly we have our work cut out for us. To really achieve these goals, a transformation of financial, economic, and political systems that govern our societies is necessary. And this transformation is underway, with voluntary schemes being bolstered by the emergence of mandatory legislative frameworks, from the Australian Modern Slavery Act to the EU legislative requirement for human rights due diligence on supply chains, which is expected in 2021. In light of this movement, it becomes even more important that we have discussions like we're going to have here today.
Thanks, Tara. Now that we've got a sense of the global commitments relating to sustainability, I think we should take a look at what's driving corporate behaviour initially and ask, why are businesses focusing on sustainability in global trade? So I'll start with Adina. Would you mind giving us your perspectives?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy, and pleasure to be here. Welcome everybody the last month of the year. So I think for me, with my experience having led the global program at Mattel and currently chair of ethical toy program, I think the biggest thing that companies are looking at are the increasing slew of regulations. Regulations have had direct impact commerce and supply chains. And, when you're in a company, each proposed new or revised piece of legislation, you have departments monitoring, reviewing, analyzing, and then having to plan out what it means to put together a plan to either lobby or get the regulations implemented. I think in recent years, there have been such a plethora of legislation that impact virtually every aspect of sustainability in the broader sense. And when I say that, it's not just the environmental sense, it is also social and governance, as Tara had nicely laid out for us. Some of the examples that we've had to deal with in our supply chains include modern slavery, and Sharon will cover this in a little bit more detail. But from the California Transparency Act to the UK Act to more recently the Australian Act, at the Ethical Toy Program, audit checklists have had to be revised to ensure now we include items which auditors have to incorporate so that factories that are in the program are not unwittingly facilitating modern slavery. One more salient example would be migrant workers paying fees to agents to get them to work in non-native provinces or countries. And that is a problem that is still very rampant, even beyond factories, I think, up to and including the domestic helper you might employ in your household. For a corporation, I think, to ensure compliance, you've got to also ensure your HR personnel understand elements of how to detect red flags, put in some basics, and having, policies, and then disclosing, reporting it in line with regulatory expectations. The other regulatory example is environmental. One of the things we had to work around was single-use plastics. We had to ensure we recreated packaging to get rid of single-use plastics and educating the consumer on how to use provided bags for proper storage instead of just throwing them away. So this couple of examples are just, regulatory examples of how business has to readjust supply chains to meet new requirements. I think the other big reason is reputation. I think as more CEOs or companies are redefining purpose within their corporations, alongside CEO activism, which is also growing, I think there is a case to be made beyond Milton Friedman's philosophy that the purpose of business is merely to have economic returns. I think today, sustainability considerations in the broader sense are merely minimum entry tickets that only get you a seat at the back of the house. Corporate customers, especially big retailers, are putting in place more demands because they are also riding on the consumer wave. So you have corporations that are daring to take more of a social political stance on social justice issues like Black Lives Matter. Investment criteria have also evolved, and Matt, being the expert, will tell you a little later in this session, where investors are no longer just looking at the economics in the companies that they're investing, because they also have their own commitments which they want to realize through their portfolios. Thanks. 7 years, yeah. So go ahead, Jeremy.
No, thanks, Adiga. So shifting from manufacturing to resources, Sharon, from your perspective, what's driving the commercial world's focus on sustainability and global trade?
Thanks, Jeremy. And maybe just for some context, for many of you may not know what South32 is, but we're a base minerals and mining company based in Perth, Western Australia, operations in South Africa, Australia, Colombia, Mozambique, America, exploration. There's a lot going on. So there are a lot of drivers for sustainability for us as a business, but perhaps what I might focus on is the particular work stream that I look at, which is human rights, and within that, modern slavery. And what's driving us at its core is a few things, but number one, it's the law. So as a few have mentioned, there's been a rise of modern slavery dedicated legislation in California, the UK, in Australia, both at a Commonwealth and state level, and even emerging legislation in Canada and in Hong Kong. You actually have a draft modern slavery bill. I don't know what the prospects of that are. Others can probably speak to that with more authority, but the simple point is that legislators are really looking at this specific issue quite closely. And that's because it taps into one of the SDG goals that Tara mentioned, which is decent work. And for a business, it's fundamentally unacceptable for us to have what is essentially criminal behavior in our supply chains. And actually, maybe on that, it's helpful to explain like what is modern slavery. Modern slavery at its core is when someone's freedom has been stripped away from them. And that can be the freedom to choose to stop work, or the freedom to do certain types of work, or the freedom to move. Freedom can be taken away sort of by a range of issues, but it could be threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power, deception. It's very creative and very extreme exploitative criminal behavior. And so if you want the technical terms, it's bonded labour, forced labour, human trafficking, child labour, deceptive recruitment, and other sort of more legal terms. And the scale of it is quite huge. So in my hat as previously working for an anti-slavery organisation, I can, the figures are 40.3 million people are estimated to be in forms of modern slavery, and a lot of that is in the Asia Pacific region. So yeah, as a company, that's what's driving us, and fundamentally it's just the right thing to do as well. As a business, as we're moving to try and promote broader sustainability goals, tackling this sort of extreme criminal behaviour makes sense, because at the other end of the spectrum is what we're aiming for as a business, to be making sure that we're providing safe and decent work for not only our employees, but our workers in our supply chain.
Thanks, Sharon. Lastly, looking at this from a financial markets perspective, Matt, why are businesses focusing on sustainability in global trade?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, certainly I've been looking at this from a financial services perspective through the lens of ESG from an investment point of view, but also in terms of the investment banks that we represent from a sustainable finance perspective. And I really think there's a confluence of factors. I think Adina mentioned previously some comments around consumer demand. So I think from a business point of view, there's a different type of consumer. They're equally interested in product and services, but as much as they're interested in reputation and where products are sourced from, etc. From a financial services perspective, I think it's important to look at investor demand. So that covers a whole gamut from retail. So I think there's literally, just as there's millennial consumers coming through, we're seeing on the retail front, retail investor front, millennials looking for, a balance between commercial return, financial returns, as well as, what are the activities that they're investing in. But equally, and perhaps more importantly, on the institutional investor side, sovereign wealth funds, for example, are looking at how they're investing their money. Pension funds, whether it's Australia or other markets, or the Canadian Pension Fund, for example, they're looking for the information about the investments and companies that they're investing in to understand, how is their investment being used. Finally, I'd also, in terms of those kinds of shareholders, stakeholders, I'd also refer to activist shareholders. So, many of the large institutional asset managers are now taking their stewardship responsibilities very, very seriously, and that plays out in terms of what they do choose to invest in and what they don't. But also, it's not always just a decision about pulling out of a company, their investment out of a company, if they don't agree with their management style on sustainability issues. Sometimes they'll actually choose to stay within a company to see whether they can help transition. We're also seeing, from a company perspective and investor perspective, many of the exchanges looking at sustainability. So Hong Kong Exchange, for example, looking at environmental management, looking for an uptick in terms of reporting. So I think we're also seeing evolution from, maybe annual reports 10 years ago might have looked at sustainability, a very separate kind of reporting around, charities that they might be involved in, or some of the great work that they might be doing almost as a separate silo, whereas I think there's much more focus on integrating sustainability into day-to-day operations, etc. So that's on the investor side. I think some of the other speakers also mentioned regulation. So from a financial services perspective, it's very interesting. We've seen the network of the greening of the financial system. So that's many central banks headed by, originally by the Bank of England, looking at climate-related climate-related financial risk. And so there's a lot of push on the financial services sector to look at the macro level scenario planning in the same way that we look at financial risks, economic risks. We're being asked to look at financial risks related to climate change, and that could be literally because of transition risk or stranded assets in certain sectors that might be in much more difficult terrain from a regulatory perspective going down the track. There's also been, in many countries like Australia, for example, after the Hayne Royal Commission, a focus on governance. We're also seeing in countries like China a much more focus on, a greater focus on corporate governance as well. And then I think there's also another factor, which is from a financial services perspective. I've talked about risk and regulatory drivers, but I think there's also a focus on opportunity. I think we've just released a report looking at climate finance, and if we're to tally up the requirements to get to carbon neutrality in the next 30 years, it's looking like globally that there's a need for 110 to 150 trillion investment. And so, and within Asia alone, that's 66 trillion. So there's a definite need to kind of move things along. And I think financial services are seeing both kind of a need to move things along, but also opportunity in making sure that the markets are there, supporting some of the changes that are necessary.
Thanks, Matt. And so Tara, I'll hand it to you to explore current issues in sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this part of the conversation is going to be divided. First, we're going to talk about social, and then we're going to get to environmental. And with social, there's clearly a lot of human rights issues we could be talking about. But because we have the wonderful benefit of having Sharon and Kyle on the call today, who have great experience looking specifically at the issue of modern slavery and thinking about what they can do within their current organizations and roles to tackle this, this is what we're going to talk about. So Sharon, if I can ask you first, you've set the background for us on what is modern slavery and why it matters. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing about it?
Yeah, sure, no worries. So we are in our 5th year of reporting as business on slavery, driven by originally the UK Act and now the recent Australian Act. And so at the very start, I would say it's a journey. If you look at our very first statement, so all of them are available online, you'll see it's a very short 1 to 2 page statement of intent, basically, that says we recognise this is the issue and that we are very early on in our journey of improvement on this, and it doesn't say too much else. And then if you go to our 5th year statement, which is the one we just published, you can see it's really progressed to about 25 pages of really articulating what are our risks, what's our audit program, what are our targets and case studies. And I would say even then, and Kyle can talk to this as an industry that's far more progressed than mining, it's still really at very early stages. So when I talk about an audit program, the retailers or the fast moving goods people in the room will be shocked to hear that our audit program is so simple. At its core, we're still just doing about 10 audits a year, because that's the maturity of our industry and what we can really invest in at the moment. And but what we're seeing is really really detailed information that we previously would never have had in the mining sector about the workers in our supply chain. So we're using independent auditors to go in and speak not only to management and not only check the books and records, but most importantly, speak to workers. And for us as an industry, that's the very first time we've ever talked to workers directly in our supply chain about issues of human rights. And you'd be surprised, they're pretty open and really interesting issues that we would never have known were in our first tier of suppliers. And so for us, we're really just starting to understand what are our risks in that sector. And these are, while mining has its own particular sort of context, at its core, when you're talking about slavery, you're talking about vulnerable workers, people who are often out of sight. They're in that more informal economy or seasonal type work. They're doing that lower paid type of, either for us, it could be cleaning, security, maintenance services. It could be in our ships, the seafarers, they're very much out of sight. And so for us, it's really going deeper and trying to look at, well, who are those vulnerable workers and how can we actually have impact? Because I would also say there is so much regulation and emerging reporting expectations on companies. And so we want to make sure we're not just providing another statement that nobody reads and sits on our website, but it's actually having impact. And so, and I think the Australian Act really has got a few key mandatory criteria in that makes us do that as well. Look at, are we being effective and are we actually addressing the root cause issues of this type of criminal behaviour? And I'd finally just say that the key for us has been engagement, not only at that engaging with the workers, but engaging with our senior management on this. Because without senior buy-in and leadership on this, I don't think that we'd have the impact that we need to have. And also critically working with our peers. So a lot of what I do is making sure that we're leveraging and sharing resources with our peers, our suppliers across sectors, because this really isn't a competitive issue. And also it's a huge issue. So in order to start to tackle this, we really do have to work together.
Absolutely, Sharon, you've made so many important points and I wish I had time to unpack them all with you. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate is your transparency around the fact of, the first step was really making that commitment. And then it's been a journey and there is so much work that needs to be undertaken in this space. And so I think it's important that we set expectations and we recognize that the important thing is to take those steps in the right direction and to make sure that we're doing it right, to ensure we're engaging with workers and, as you say, peers and other stakeholders. So Kyle, I'd love to hear more about from your experience along this journey. Tell us more about what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me participate. Perhaps a little context on VF as well. So VF, we are a New York Exchange, US-based apparel and footwear company. We own brands such as the North Face, Vans, Dickies, Timberland, and now Supreme. We have a large supply chain that is quite complex. So we're working with contract manufacturers that produce our goods, so the finished goods, and they are buying raw materials from a tier 2 supplier who is buying yarn and cotton from a tier 3 supplier. Jenner is ultimately buying products, raw materials from farm level or a slaughterhouse in the case of leather. So it's quite complex and it's a bit difficult for VF to see end to end on the supply chain. So I think one of the steps that we took a number of years ago was to truly understand what our human rights risks are in our supply chain. I think as a company, we had an overall understanding of what the risks are based on our years of audit data, based on industry knowledge, and unfortunately, many human rights related stories on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in the apparel and footwear space. But we wanted to take a more data-driven approach in our due diligence. So we partnered with a number, and we continue to partner with a number of external consultants, research groups, using governmental studies to gain a better perspective of the risks that are prevalent in our supply chain, based on really severity, prevalence, and egregiousness. And then it gives us the opportunity to focus in on those particular areas that are a challenge for us. This covers our entire supply chain. It's done on a yearly basis or when situations change. A prime example, we just purchased, or we're in the process of purchasing the streetwear brand Supreme. When we integrate Supreme into our supply chain, of course, we're going to have to go through the whole due diligence process again to identify the new risks that may be present. So when our first due diligence was completed, as I mentioned, there's nothing really surprising to us in the findings. But what was important was that we were able to prioritize based on data where we should be focused, and realizing that we can't solve all of the world's problems at once. We need to focus on where can we have the greatest impact to the workers. And one of those examples was around migrant work. While our entire supply chain is around 1 million workers across the globe, there's a small subset of less than 1% of those workers who are facing challenges with recruitment fees. These are fees primarily paid prior to them arriving in the country of destination. They have high interest rates or in bonded situations. They could have their passports withheld from them, et cetera. So the due diligence that we've done internally has really directed our focus to 3 primary countries, that being Taiwan, Jordan, and Thailand, because they are the highest number of migrant workers that we have in our supply chain. And we've quickly developed public commitments. We've been working with NGOs, one of them being the IOM, where Tara is representing as well, the International Organization on Migration. They've partnered with us and helped us to essentially rewrite our internal policies, to rewrite our external facing policies to our suppliers, conduct countless trainings with our teams. And to Sharon's point, I think we're a bit more advanced on the audit side, but how can we rewrite our audit programs as well to get after some of these core indicators that may tell us forced labor is prevalent in a facility. And we'll continue to work on those as well as a toolkit in our factories in Jordan, Taiwan, and Thailand over the next 12 to 18 months.
This is all great, and I think it's wonderful to hear about the emphasis that VF has put on evidence, because you're absolutely right that you have to know exactly where your vulnerabilities are, where the risks are, and then be able to respond accordingly, and of course to prioritize, because especially for a company like VF and for so many out there, supply chains are massive, and there are so many potential entry points that you really need to be realistic about, like you said, where you can have the greatest impact. And of course, IOM is very happy that despite how small the prevalence of migrant workers is in your supply chains, that you recognize that with having the right management and due diligence systems in place, you can really affect widespread change. So that's great. And actually, we're going to switch gears a little bit now. I'm going to stay with you, though, Kyle, and switch gears over to environmental, because it'll be interesting to hear how BF is sort of applying these same evidence-driven principles to tackling environmental issues.
Yeah, okay, well, great. So my role primarily focuses on the S in ESG, the social side, but I do sit in the sustainability, so I have a good understanding. It's been a busy past 12 months at VF and our environmental strategy. I think perhaps the most important thing we've done as a company in this area is that in late 2019, we committed to science-based targets. So once again, evidence-driven science-based targets. We've set an absolute reduction of our scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gases by 55% by 2030. And we've set scope 3 by 30% by 2030. As I mentioned in my previous comments about our supply chain being complex, it's no different when it comes to through the lens of environmental. For example, 99% of our VF emissions come through scope 3. So if you think about it, this is material extraction, production, raw material. We have limited impact, limited direct impact as a brand to where these emissions are taking place. So what have we been doing? We've been working with our key suppliers in our tier 1 to get them to commit to science-based targets as well as we have. Developing a baseline. We're doing this through an industry platform called HIG. We're driving and working on reduction targets in their scope 1 and scope 2, which is essentially their supply chain. And we're partnering with various industries and NGOs around the world to really drive this change. One of those would be the National Resource Defense Council. We're working with them on things like improving boiler efficiencies, adding insulation to piping, optimizing your compressed air within a facility, et cetera. Not only are these lowering our greenhouse gases, but they're also saving money for the factories at the end of the day, and that's really appreciated. We're also working with the IFC and we've been working with the IFC since 2014 in Vietnam on resource efficiency projects. We're proud at the moment, the largest solar array in Vietnam is on one of our factories, and it was through the IFC program. And I know I'm a bit out of time, but I'd like to touch on one other important topic at VF, and that is something that in early 2020, we closed on a 500 million euro green bond. This was the first in the apparel and footwear space. We plan to use the net proceeds of this bond to really support the work that my team and others are doing and to align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our three primarily areas that we're focusing on is one, sustainable product and materials. So we're committed to using 100% of our top 9 materials from regenerative, recycled, or renewed by 2030. We're focusing on our supply chain, the energy efficiency programs that I recently mentioned, and then lastly, carbon neutral sinks. So we're really looking at reforestation, conservation projects, investment into regenerative agriculture, et cetera, across our supply chain.
Wow, this is all brilliant, and congratulations to you and your colleagues for taking this on and for doing so many wonderful initiatives. Adina, I'd like to turn to you. Kyle has covered off a lot of different areas of how businesses can really contribute to environmental issues. Would you, from your experience, can you tell us a bit more about what the Ethical Toy Program is doing?
Sure. I think maybe less about the Ethical Toy Program, given what Kyle and Matt are going to cover in this section. Perhaps one of the things I would focus on being a challenge on environmental side is the challenge on a true circular economy. I think that there are a lot of disparate efforts by different folks around the world to achieve so-called environmental sustainability, but they don't always add up. I think that there's a lot of positive work going on, but materials alone, while somewhat helpful, rarely do the trick. I think to truly achieve zero waste with full reuse or recyclability in its life cycle, it's challenging with the economics. And I think that's one of the main things that I believe regulators around the world, alongside collaborating with the other stakeholders, should maybe give a little bit more thought through. The reason I say that is when we create a product, and when I was at Mattel, and this was no different, and Kyle can sort of maybe talk about his experience at BF, but the economics with the take back program or recycling infrastructure does remain challenging around the world. It's very dependent on the logistics infrastructure, and that extends in the supply chain to retailers who have to think about collection and storage. Then it's followed by how do you deliver that, or how do the recyclers collect that? That's still quite immature for us, and I think jurisdictions around the world could do a lot more to support companies that are engaging in this effort, because at the end of the day, I think companies can do a lot to bring sustainable product into the markets, but what happens at the towards the end of the life cycle of that product. And the next example is no slight on the folks at Bacardi, but I recently read the example of Bacardi who unveiled a bioplastic bottle that can biodegrade in compost systems, freshwater, and oceans in 18 months. It's great. I think, and they call it a silver bullet in the fight against plastic pollution. But unfortunately, it was called out by the author as BS. And this is not a slight to Bacardi again, but it's about the what happens at the end of it, right? Because there is limited global composting infrastructure. So the likelihood of that bottle being composted is actually pretty low in real life. And then how do you make the consumer recycle that, because compostable bioplastics also look different or look very similar to recyclable bioplastics, but they're not the same thing. So there's, in this situation, it may create a lot more problems than solutions. But that said, some progress is better than none. We've also had similar challenges in the toy industry. And for the toy industry, product safety is paramount. So we've had innovations with sugarcane, milk jugs, they help. But I think from a scale perspective, capacity, cost reasons, things are still very, very challenging. And that's why I would definitely call for a lot more collaboration to tackle this problem.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm very happy that you are flagging the many challenges associated with affecting real change. And it's going to rely on consumers, right? We really need to rethink our purchasing decisions, right? So, shifting away from this emphasis on fast fashion and people, maybe buying less, but higher quality, right? And you also raise a great point about the role of regulators, that ultimately companies can do their best with the resources and recourse that they have, but there are systemic challenges to this work. And so on that note, I'd actually like to hand it over to Matt to bring us to talk a little bit more about the sort of the environment of finances again, and touch on the role of regulators.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tara. Yeah, I mentioned previously our report and the opportunity, or actually challenge, around requiring 110 to 150 trillion US dollars, and that's just to meet climate change targets to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's over the next 30 years. In a way, that's quite a scary and challenging concept, because it's a very large problem that we need to deal with, and this is just climate finance. This is just climate change, and perhaps I can unpack a little bit from a kind of public policy perspective. Some of the challenges are around, and things that we need to get right in order to be effective here, and generally with environmental concerns, is a lack of standards. So we're an international trade association. We're looking at financial services issues and how that interacts with the real economy. But we're also looking across borders. So I look across Asia, but also work with my colleagues in Europe and US. So there's a real challenge around lack of standards, and that can play out in terms of taxonomy. So we talk often about green taxonomies. There's been a lot of work, and the EU's played a significant role in terms of taking a leadership position on defining a green taxonomy for the EU. China, interestingly enough, has also been quite a leader in terms of building out a taxonomy, and yet they're quite different. And we are seeing convergence, which is great, but still they're quite different in terms of what they do and don't class as a green investment opportunity. And it's only been recently, for example, that China reviewed whether it would actually put fossil fuels in its green taxonomy. We're seeing Singapore looking at its taxonomy. Malaysia's also been looking at its taxonomy. So there's a real challenge or potential for there to be different approaches, both in terms of what's classed as green, what's not, but also the approaches that they take. So whether they're more principles-based, whether they're much more prescriptive. So again, there's a difference between China, which is a little bit more prescriptive, than the EU, which is a little bit more principles-based. That's one issue. Then how does that fold into accounting treatment? So there's a whole variety of different accounting treatments for this. And again, if we're looking across different markets and sectors, from a financial services perspective, it becomes very challenging if people are measuring things in different ways, showing information in different ways. And so again, there needs to be a whole convergence in terms of how we're dealing with sustainability issues from an accounting treatment perspective. Obviously, some things, some frameworks are evolving, SASB, GRI, etc. Thirdly, there's also just fragmentation generally in terms of regulation and policy. So again, we're seeing fragmentation across different jurisdictions, so different regions taking a different approach to environmental risk, for example, prudential regulation for financial services, how they're looking at climate-related financial risk, for example, but then also within jurisdictions, sometimes between sectors, there's not necessarily the consistency that we probably need to meet some of the challenges that we have. Another issue is around corporate disclosure. So there's been great work, and some of the speakers today have talked about some of the great work that's been done in terms of corporate disclosure. But again, there's different approaches being taken in different jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, there's a much higher level standard to which companies have to disclose by than others. And so unless you tighten up those things, and on top of that have consistency internationally, because these are international problems that we're dealing with, then you really face another challenge in terms of bringing together these efforts and getting the required coordination necessary. Then again, even if you get all that right, there's data challenges. So one of the things from a financial services perspective and investor perspective is data. So even if you have the same reporting and the same requirements and the same green taxonomy, for example, what you class as green and not, is the availability of data. Whether it's available, whether it's science-based and therefore reliable, and also whether it's accessible. There's a whole, we also had a recent paper on this. We've been working with the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, which is an industry partnership looking at just the challenge of data. And that's a real challenge because unless investors can see consistency, but also deal with, for example, the fact that some information comes directly from the company, and maybe it's through corporate disclosure, and maybe that's quite systematic. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very unstructured data. How do you look at information about social programs, which is not structured, to compare between different projects, compare different sectors? From a market structure point of view, there's challenges. Again, we've talked about lack of standards, but also incentives. So we're also looking at things in relation to climate finance around subsidization of certain industries and certain technologies, for example, which skew the markets, or the fact that we don't necessarily price carbon. So again, that's another opportunity for the market to be skewed. And that's one of the challenges we've been looking at recently with climate finance is this massive need, which I talked about before. Investors are very interested in investing in climate friendly investments and projects and sectors, and at the same time, capital is not being motivated. And a large part of that is the lack of incentives, the lack of pricing in carbon, for example. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around market structures. And then finally, the point on coordination. It's very difficult to underestimate how much coordination is required, both between the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector. So we talked about the role of NGOs, but the regulators need to play their role, as do the private sector. There also needs to be coordination between sectors. So for example, if we're to meet just the climate finance goals around limiting temperature rises, then you need to look at the power industry. You then also need to look at, well, how does that interact with the transport sector? How does that relate to the industry sector and the chemical sector if we're looking at batteries? And so there's a lot of coordination required across the global economy and then within nation-based national economies. And then finally, getting back down to the kind of practicalities, this is a multidisciplinary concern. So even within companies and within financial firms as well as corporates, it's bringing together a whole lot of disciplines together. Strategy, reporting, which we talked about, investment decision making, encompassing environmental concerns, encompassing environmental risk management in standard risk management and so on. So very challenging task, but we've got to, I guess, put one foot in front of the other and start making the changes necessary.
Well, absolutely. And Matt, I think my favorite part about you listing out all of the challenges is that I know that you're thinking about them and that you and others are actively looking at these challenges, unpacking them and figuring out, how do we work together to address these? So I'm, even though I find it really overwhelming and scary to listen to you, I'm also very optimistic that you'll figure it out. But I'd like to stay with this theme of challenges, but from challenges seeing opportunities. And so, I'd like to bring it back to Sharon and Kyle to speak from your experience with implementation. Where have you really hit challenges or obstacles, and then where have you seen opportunities to sort of overcome these? So Sharon, if I can ask you first.
No worries. So I guess one of the initial things of being an industry that's quite new to looking at these types of social issues is just the mindset shift. So for example, a really classic example is, so if we do find risks of modern slavery or human rights concerns, often the procurement team's first response is, let's terminate, let's find another supplier. And we know as sustainability professionals and from research by NGOs and advice is that doesn't address the root cause issue, it just pushes it into another sector of the economy. And so if you really want to have sustainable impact, the opportunity is to work with your suppliers and create that into a development opportunity to say, look, we're willing to work with you if you continue to be transparent with us. Let's do this in partnership. We have our own issues. These are systemic challenges that no company is immune from. So that's a challenge and also an opportunity for us as a business. So you can see in our modern slavery statement is a really good example of working with our PPE provider, which moved their factory from, we work in South Africa, so they moved their factory from Johannesburg to Lesotho. And for those that know, Lesotho is a really tiny emerging market country with very few labour controls and processes. So that's an immediate red flag for us going, well, why are you moving your factory? And the knee-jerk reaction could have been, well, let's terminate and just go with a more reputable, bigger PPE supplier. But actually it was a really great opportunity for our supply team to go in, and there was very real challenges recognizing that Lesotho is a tiny country, but also by having the factory based in that region, we were supplying jobs to 700 individuals, and the net impact of that on the families and the economy of Lesotho was saying, well, actually we're going to bring up and provide business opportunities that wasn't previously there. And so that was hard. It was definitely a long journey for our suppliers to go, our supply team to go down, but that's where we're seeing the opportunities. And so I think for us, COVID has brought a whole nother set of challenges and opportunities as well. So with our rapid sourcing, again, around medical supplies and PPE, we know there's really real challenges in the China region for that. And really high industry demand. So the practicalities of doing due diligence when you have turnaround times of 24 hours or even less is really difficult. But when you have good relationships and you've got a mindset of transparency, I think we're seeing mindset shifts both within our own teams and our external teams. And then I just say personally for sustainability professionals or people who are trying to tackle this, the challenge and the opportunity again is showing your companies and your stakeholders how this all fits together. Because there are so many issues when you're talking about sustainability challenges, whether they're social or environmental. And the reality is that they don't all nicely sit in separate boxes, they overlap. So when you're talking about climate change, there are really significant human rights impacts of climate change. When you're talking about modern slavery, you're tapping into a range of health and safety, also sometimes waste reduction issues. In Australia, we're looking a lot at cultural heritage and Indigenous people groups. And so when you start to look at all these issues, the challenge is to bring it all together and show businesses that actually the same tools and processes and procedures can be applied to each of these issues. So when we're doing due diligence on our suppliers on modern slavery, that those similar tools can be used for scope 3 emissions, for example, or water reduction. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time a new issue faces you in your inbox, but actually think about the way that we are doing business is fundamentally shifting. So.
That's brilliant, Sharon. I don't think it could have been said better. I think it's really important to recognize that you can use the same tools to be inclusive of so many issues that we're all facing. And I also, I just want to reiterate your point around the importance of really investing in your business partners and ensuring that they're going along this journey with you in terms of addressing sustainability issues. I think that's definitely a very good practice. Kyle, I'd love to hear from you where you've seen some exciting opportunities to overcome challenges in this space.
Yeah, Well, there are many challenges that we still face, and COVID has definitely multiplied those challenges around the world, and especially in my seat where we've been grounded, we've been unable to go visit our 1,000+ factory locations. It really makes it difficult. So it's brought an opportunity, and I think that opportunity for us has been technology. COVID hasn't brought technology to us necessarily, but it's definitely speeded our adoption of technology in the past 12 months. So I guess circling back to my previous comments on migrant workers, even before COVID, it was extremely difficult for us as a company to interact with the wide range of migrant workers when we're actually visiting a factory. This is primarily due to language concerns. For example, if I show up to a factory in Jordan, the management team will speak English, the local workers will speak Arabic, the migrant workers are going to be speaking Bangla, Hindi, Burmese, and no matter how many people I bring on my team to go visit the factory, there's always going to be one group of individuals that ultimately falls through the cracks, no matter how hard we're trying to not allow that to happen. So one of the ways that we've sort of tried to change this, and we're in the early stages of this now, but it's how can we utilize worker voice and technology for training? We personally have partnered with a number of companies. Yalula and Quizar are the two companies we're working with now, but they're developing really video trainings, employee surveys, grievance channels that can all be pushed to a worker's smartphone or dumb phone, depending on where you're at and what access to technology you have. It ensures that our sort of message, our policy and procedures is being consistently applied across the entire factory base in a language that the workers can understand, and they can do it at their own convenience. And I guess having this connection to the worker, I think it was Sharon that mentioned it earlier, what is the impact of the actual worker? I mean, historically, brands like VF, when we've rolled out programs, our KPI has been how many trainings did we do? How many people attended our trainings? And that was how we determined whether or not we were making impact. But unfortunately, we never truly knew what the workers felt. Did the workers truly feel there was an impact? Was there a change to their life? And we're hoping that by utilizing this new technology, getting those workers to have a voice to us as a brand and to the factory management, that we can truly measure whether or not we're making change. And if we're not making change, we need to reassess and try something different. So that's one aspect of technology. Another aspect of technology that I think is pretty cool is a tool that VF has been piloting. It's been developed here in Hong Kong and Macau by a UN university as well as a Mekong club. It's called a prize audit, and what a prize audit is, it's a tablet smartphone based tool that essentially replaces a traditional worker auditor interview when you're visiting a factory. So a migrant worker, or any worker for that matter, puts on a set of headphones, grabs a tablet, grabs a phone, and begins to answer some yes/no questions that pop up. All of the questions are asked verbally in the worker's own language, so there's no risk that a manager is looking over your shoulder and seeing what you're doing. It's all on headphones and yes/no, green, red, yellow buttons on the screen. This is really provided, so we give this survey to say 10 workers. It provides our auditor with some insight into the conditions of that factory that we may not have had previously. So it's not necessarily going to say you have a forced labor issue and this is exactly what it is, but it is going to identify indicators of forced labor. And therefore our auditors who are trained can then dig deeper and start to ask the right questions where prior to technology, they may have completely missed that topic. So we're in the early stages of both of these, but both are promising. Both can be done relatively remotely, which is fantastic in the world we're living in today. And what we hope is, while it's starting with migrant workers, we're hoping that all of our worker rights streams that I lead, whether it be gender-based violence or harassment or freedom of association, et cetera, that we can overlay this sort of new technology on all of those and ultimately measure the impact of the workers at the end of the day.
Brilliant. I wasn't aware that you were working with UNU and the Mekong Club on a prize. That's excellent. And actually here in Hong Kong, we're coordinating with them to adapt the tool to the context of domestic workers. So it's a really exciting initiative. So I think, thank you again, Sharon and Kyle. Those were, I think, really great practical examples of how you are using diverse ways of overcoming challenges, which are very real and constantly changing. So Jeremy has just put a plug in the chat that if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. But I'm now going to, I'm going to bring it back to Adina. We fit a lot of information and a very wide variety of sustainability issues into a super short amount of time. I think any one of these topics could have been their own webinar. So I'm going to ask Adina to sort of bring it all together a little bit for us in no pressure. But what's your vision for sustainable supply chains 2030?
I think if I had to bring it home, Tara, maybe the one thing that I would say is, what is true resilience for both people and the environment? And I think that probably will resonate with a lot of people. One, the pandemic fallout has taught us that it's the economically challenged that are affected in more exponential ways than we are more privileged to have tolerated. One of the things I think that at the Ethical Toy Program we've seen sort of real progress is we introduced a remediation program where factories and brands who are really committed to making real change want to implement, and the fallout from COVID has sort of accelerated the adoption of those progress because factories do want to make real progress in whether it's their health and safety systems or address issues as Kyle mentioned, freedom of movement, excessive overtime, gender-based violence as fallouts from the pandemic. I think the other thing with technology, which Kyle also mentioned, adoption of mobile phone applications, so that even if on-site audits are compromised or reduced, they're not necessarily eliminated, and actually do provide quite a different perspective, as Sharon also talked about. So that ability to listen to the voice of the worker, I think that's going to be critical. And then one of the things that we're really proud of at the Ethical Toy Program is our family-friendly factory spaces, which actually seeks to address some of the challenges with migrant worker parents having to leave their children, but using this program to bring them to factories to encourage better parent-child relationships. And that really also, beyond the worker, has also brought a lot of productivity and worker efficiency to factories that are willing to host such an arrangement. So it's a win-win, we feel, for everyone. Then I think, just bring it back to the SDGs. I would hope that, with 10 years out, everyone, no matter who you are, should have a vision of what they mean to you. And set targets. We're all about progress, not perfection. How does everyone contribute? And if we make that start, I think we're going to be in a much better place. On the environmental side, Tara, you talked about this as well, reduce and reuse, right? Beyond just consumption, how do we think about reducing waste? And that's one of the things that, I would hope consumers and companies and everyone else embrace. Finally, bring it back to the consumer. I think education, awareness, but most importantly, impetus for the consumer to want to change I would hope to see in over the next 10 years. Back to you.
Great, that was brilliant. So many excellent calls to action that are really sort of across organizations and individuals. I haven't seen any questions come in, and we do have some time remaining with this excellent panel. So I might put everyone on the spot and ask each of you to sort of say what would be your priority or your call to action for people tuning in today, the organizations where they work, to achieve in the next 10 years in this decade of action. So Matthew, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. What would be your final words on this?
Thanks, Tara. Look, I'm actually very optimistic. I talked about how massive the challenge was, how complex the challenge is, even just focusing on one area, which is climate. But at the same time, you know, picture this: we've had 14 investment banks come together who would normally be competing and say, we need to have concerted effort. So there's a real, and I talked previously in one of my first responses about a confluence of factors, and I think we can take some comfort from that, because I think people are recognizing the need that we need to solve some of these challenges. There's a whole lot of people moving in the same direction of travel, and there's a growing recognition that we need to coordinate. So yes, so you've got 14 competitors saying we need to do something here. They're also saying please regulate, which again you might be surprised by. So the fact that there's a real movement, and perhaps maybe it is COVID, what we've been through, and some of the challenges that we've had. But I think there is a possibility of being quite optimistic about bringing these things together. And I think there's a lot of motivation that I'm seeing to actually start to solve these things, and for the connections that need to be made to connect, and for the contributions that need to be made.
Wonderful. I'm very glad that you share my optimism. Kyle, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
I think it comes down to the consumer at the end of the day. And I think that consumers, and anyone, myself and everyone else included, you need to vote with your dollars and vote with your money, and vote for the companies that are doing the right thing, that have the purpose and are driving towards a sustainable vision. And hopefully, what they say, all boats, high tide raises all boats, right? At least that would be the hope. And therefore, companies like VF that are already doing a great thing, we get the consumer demand, and it's a cycle that allows us to continue to invest more and to be more innovative and to drive for change faster.
That's great. And Sharon?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in 10 years' time, what I'd probably like to see is that we've demonstrated that this, being a sustainable business, can have commercial value. So it's not just about responding and reacting, writing long sustainability reports and statements and creating more processes and systems, but that we're actually demonstrating that this not only has social positive impact, but also has really demonstrable sort of commercial value for our businesses, because the reality is sustainability teams and the jobs that we're all in are stretched. We have limited resources, and the challenges just keep getting bigger and bigger. And I think the opportunity for us to do business better is to demonstrate that at the end of the day, by doing this, you actually do create commercial value for your businesses, as well as creating sustainable economies and communities that we want to live in. So that's the vision.
Yeah, excellent. And I think if everyone will indulge me, I'd actually like for my last remarks to be a quote. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, at the start of this decade to action, he called for renewed ambition, mobilization, leadership, and collective action, not just to beat COVID-19, but to recover better together, winning the race against climate change, decisively tackling poverty and inequality, truly empowering all women and girls, and creating more inclusive and equitable societies everywhere. And I would just like to thank the speakers today so much, because I think you've not only shed light on the huge diversity of opportunities and initiatives for positive change that are being taken forward. But you have also shown us how each of us and the organizations where we work have an important role to play, which are ultimately varied but hugely complementary. So thank you again to everyone. And thank you again to everyone joining in. I hope that you are all as inspired as I was. And I'll throw it back to Jeremy to close us out.
Thank you, Tara. I would echo Tara's thanks to the panel, but I'd also obviously want to thank Tara for moderating the panel. I think very importantly, in a seminar where it becomes so apparent the huge task that is ahead of us on this, the optimism that you bring to it, I think is refreshing. So thank you again to the speakers as well. I mean, it was fascinating seeing that speakers from such a diverse array of sort of industries and disciplines coming at this from different angles, but still common themes emerging in terms of lessons learned applying more broadly than the specific circumstances that everyone was talking about. And so thank you to everyone. It's been really valuable, I think, having that diversity on the panel. So with that, it falls to me to bring the event to a close. So thank you everyone for attending and have a good afternoon.